So anyway, the gospel reading tells the first part of a story that really lasts for the entire second chapter of Matthew. And I think it's worth taking a look at that story as a whole, because the lectionary really never gives it to us. We never get to read the entire thing in one sitting, and parts of it we actually never really get to read. So a couple notes about what we just read. Herod in this story is Herod the Great, who was essentially a client king of Rome over Palestine, well, Judea, a puppet king, essentially. And an important fact about him is that he is quite old at this point, especially for that era when people tended to die much younger. He's at least in his late 60s, possibly older than that. And he's been on the throne for over 30 years. So he's coming to the end of his reign one way or another. Also important historical fact about Herod is that his legitimacy as a Jewish king is kind of suspect. He doesn't have the bloodlines that would make him a real king. And so he sort of has this invented past that legitimizes him as in the role that he's in as the king of Judea. Now, the Magi are translated as wise men, but really Magi refer to sort of astrologers, sort of court thinkers, and they have divined that the king of the Jews has been born, and they come into the land looking for the child called the King of the Jews. Now, that phrase, King of the Jews, would have been an extremely dangerous phrase to use to a king whose claim is so shaky, Herod. So it's no mistake that the gospel emphasizes that Herod is frightened. Herod and all of Jerusalem, probably referring to the power structure that Rome has propped up around Herod in order for Herod and that structure to oppress its people, they're frightened at this news of the King of the Jews. So he's frightened, and he's also pretty wily. He calls the Magi to him when he learns what they're looking for. And well, first, actually, he makes sure he checks with his own court prophets and discovers that, yes, in fact, Isaiah has called for the Messiah to be born in Bethlehem. So he knows that much. He calls the Magi to him in secret, learns from them when the star actually started to rise. So that gives him a sense of when Jesus was in fact born and how old he might be at this point. And then he sends them out and says, go search diligently for this child. And when you find him, make sure to report back to me so that I too can pay him homage. Now, needless to say, this is a ruler who pays homage to a new king the way the mob would have paid a visit to a merchant who won't pony up protection money. So the Magi go off. They do indeed find Jesus. They encounter the Christ. They're filled with joy. A symbolic moment of the gospel universalizing itself to Gentiles, not just to Jews. And then, instead of going back to tell Herod that they found Jesus, they quite wisely go home by another way. And maybe that's why we call them wise men. So that's the part we just read. And then in the next part that comes after, you may know this story, an angel comes in a dream to Joseph and says, you have to escape with your family to Egypt because Herod's out to murder Jesus. And so it says Joseph takes Mary and the child and flees by night to Egypt. They become these sort of immigrants fleeing political violence. And then comes a verse that I'd like to read to you. This is Matthew 2:16. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Now, this is a part that we never read. It's, in fact, tucked away on a feast day on December 28th called the feast day of the slaying of the innocents, or the holy innocents. And it never actually gets transferred to a Sunday by our lectionary. So the only way you would have come across this story in our worship is if someone had intentionally moved the feast day to a Sunday. But it's really important because this incredibly dark act, this terrible evil, has an underlying motivation that's important to the story. Herod is frightened, and now that he's been tricked, he's infuriated, which is another way of being frightened. And even though he is old, and even though he's about to die, he's clearly willing to sacrifice an entire generation simply to cling to his own power and comfort a little bit longer. Finally, at the end of chapter 2, Herod does die, and a dream again prompts the Holy Family to return to Palestine, but to move instead up to Nazareth. And that's how Jesus ends up being Jesus of Nazareth. That's where he grows up in Matthew. Now, I don't need to tell this crowd, I'm sure, that the gospel is deeply political. The very fact that the Magi come looking for the King of the Jews, as we've already explored, is an extremely politically dangerous statement. And indeed, the word gospel itself means good news. And it was originally used when Caesar would go off and conquer new lands, and the news would get spread around as the gospel, the good news that Caesar has now conquered a new realm and brought it into the Roman Empire. So the word gospel itself is taken and used by Mark and others as a highly political phrase. Now, of course, how we apply the gospel's political message to our own time is where we as Christians differ. And I would never claim to have the lock on how to do that appropriately and accurately. But I have to tell you that to my eyes, we have a tyrannical ruler with an invented history who is old, deeply frightened of any challenge to his power, and willing to sacrifice future generations for his own personal comfort and power. I gotta say, that rings some contemporary bells for me, as I imagine it does for many of you. I mean, there's a reason my Christmas play had Herod tweeting about a fake Messiah. But more deeply and importantly, I think we need only look at what has happened to our commitment to saving the environment, saving the world from global warming, to our system of education, which after all is what brings up the next generation of Americans and gives them the skills to thrive and do well, to child poverty, which remains shockingly high in the richest country in the world. Of course, to immigrants and immigrant families, many of whom are themselves refugees fleeing violence, just as Joseph and his family and Jesus were, and even to democracy itself. There are plenty of parallels that can be drawn. And all of these things have happened in the name of a kind of immediate consumption and an immediate gain, enrichment of the already rich, and clinging to power of the already powerful. Now, of course, we're called as Christians to resist those forces, to resist those kinds of changes, that status quo. But I want to be clear that the issues that are pointed to here are much bigger than any one person or even any one political party. These are huge issues that have been with us for decades, at least. And it strikes me that it's kind of funny that we think of America as a youth culture. If you're young in America, you're celebrated, you're paid attention to, and you're on top of the world in many ways. And we are that, and there's a problem with that. But are we not also a culture where the generations that continue to age are consuming at a rate that sacrifices future generations for our own comfort and, in some cases, power? So, a question I think that the gospel asks us is not who to blame, but what role have we played and do we play in this dynamic? Of what are we frightened that is driving this continued sacrifice of the future for the present? How are we, in fact, acting like Herod? You know, historically, Herod the Great spent a lot of money restoring the temple in Jerusalem and, in fact, expanding it to the north and building the tomb of the patriarchs, which you can go and visit to this day on the West Bank, and building all kinds of institutions and consuming all kinds of resources at the expense of his people. And I think it bears wondering about our age as we see ourselves pushing inequality to new heights as a culture and straining environmental resources to their breaking point. We have to wonder, will our generation acquit itself any better? So I think that the gospel today asks us to face into these questions too, so that we can act not out of the self-obsessed fear of Herod, but out of the sacrificial love of the one whose birth we celebrate. Amen.